Okay, let's get started. So, Viliami, you're down to do an opening prayer. Would you, if that's okay?
Okay. Before I say the prayer, I think we are living in a world that is more uncertain than before. A world where the environment in which we operate keep changing around us, and it's challenging. Our theme for this quarter, as we started off this new financial year here at Tonga Statistics Office, is statistical innovation, which is in line also with our project with the World Bank that has been started also. I take some scripture reading from Mark chapter 2, verses 21 to 22. No one sews a piece of unstruck cloth on an old garment. If it does, the pet stares away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If it does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. God, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together into this forum, and we know the challenge ahead of us and amongst us. We are here to discuss things that we might be able to do to mitigate the challenges with the assistance of the SPC, with the technical expertise of this group, and with the World Bank assistance to all of our small, vulnerable island states here in the Pacific. We ask for your guidance and your leadership towards the chairman and to all of us who are about to discuss matters that relates directly to our people. We ask all this in your name, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Viliami.
Hello. Yeah.
So is it worth doing a quick run round, just who's at the meeting? Oh, Kim Wiley, welcome. So maybe just do a little quick run through who's with us. I'll start. So obviously I'm Vince Galvin. Now hiding out of camera reach here is my colleague Ana Papa. Ana Papa is going to be, with Tracy helping Ofa, Ana Papa is going to be what is part of a senior member of my statistical methods team, and Ana Papa will be giving me some more direct report in this role. So welcome to the meeting, Ana Papa. Now a quick run round. Who have we got? Shall we run it? So let's just do, I'll call out names and people can just say, so I've got here, so Kim Wiley, nice to see you.
Well, Vince, and good morning to you all. It's good to see you wonderfully well and in good health. Malo Vili. Thank you.
Malo.
Okay, so I've got my list here. I've got Bruce. You're all good there?
Yeah, hello everyone. Yeah, Bruce Fraser from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Look, my internet seems to be struggling a little. It comes and goes. So if I turn my camera off, I'm trying to stop my internet from crashing.
Right. Okay. We won't feel
slighted.
No. Okay. Oh, there's Kristen.
So I'm Kristen Himmeline. I'm here from the World Bank. I'm the senior economist and statistician based in Washington. I am also the team leader for the World Bank in the Pacific. I'm joined by my colleague Darian Naidu. He is one of our poverty economists based in Sydney. And I think you'll begin to see a little bit more of my colleagues Tawfiq and Darian as I begin to sundown my time in the Pacific. I am, as of July 1, on 50% time, and I'll rotate out a year from now.
Okay, right. Okay, well, I hope we get to see you in real life before then. Okay, So welcome, Darian. Nice to meet you.
Hi, thanks.
Who else have we got here? Tracy.
So quick, good morning. I'm in Christchurch, working in the Pacific program for Stats NZ with Orpha, who unfortunately can't be here today, but will be with us tomorrow.
Right. Who else have we? On my screen, I've got James.
Good morning, everyone. I'm James Kapuka. I'm based in Suva. I work for UNICEF multi-country office. I am a focal person who is coordinating the multiple indicator cluster service within the region. Nice meeting you all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, James. I'll leave you to last with the team there, Michael, but Gloria?
Hello, my name is Gloria Mathenge. I'm with SPC in the Statistics Division working on civil registration and vital statistics. Thank you.
Okay, nice to meet you, Gloria. Who else have we got here? I've got a list across the top of my screen that I'm trying to make sense of. Elizabeth?
Yep. Hello, Elizabeth from SDD.
Right.
Yeah, no more. Thank you.
Angela? No? I've got...
Sorry, this is Angela Templeton during the meeting.
Bring me into life there.
Pardon?
You're in Christchurch, right, okay. And you're our rapporteur.
Yes, exactly.
Fantastic. So I'm just looking at so I've got Nilima, is that right?
Hi, I'm Nilima. I'm from SPC.
Right, okay. So right, okay. So you're and I've got something else here. I'm not sure which is his first name, which is the surname. Galilei?
Good morning. No, it's Gail.
I thought it might be a fusion.
No. I'm from SDD as well.
Oh,
Thanks.
okay. So we've got a group of you all on the screen there. Okay, and so we've done Alison. Have we done you?
Just an observer. Alison
Right.
Colpin from SDD as well in New
Okay, welcome, Alison. Yeah. Winston.
Hi everyone, Winston from STD is an observer.
Okay, righto. And then I'm not sure who we've got. I already counted you as done, Viliami. I hope you don't need to introduce yourself again. And I'm going to look down at my list. Alan, you're not Jenny Nichols, you're Alan, even though you come up as Jenny.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure why Zoom thinks I'm a female, but there you go. I'm the consultant that Michael's pulled in to put together the project operations manual. So a bit of background, ABS for 34 years, so I know Bruce reasonably well. Then I was the regional coordinator for the global strategy in Asia Pacific, so I know Chris Ryan pretty well. And I've met quite a few people around the Pacific, particularly Fiji and Samoa, but also met Viliami at APCAS a couple of years ago. So a smattering of people have met me before. I think I've even met you, Vince, when I was in ABS and we had a meeting in Wellington. So,
oh, okay. Very likely.
Thank you.
So
nice to be with you all.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Alan. Chris, we met you before, and so I haven't actually asked you to introduce yourself, but you might as well do that.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Ryan, so I'm the statistician with SCAP based in Suva.
Right. And hopefully that means we're down to the team at SPC with you, Michael.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Just to let you know, Gloria, Elizabeth, Nalima, Gail, Alison, Tonga, and Scotty and Winston, they're from the Statistics for Development Division, and we've just invited them to sit and observe the meeting. So they're all joining separately, but I'll go around the room, starting with the boss here.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Looking forward to all the discussions this morning.
Hi, I'm David Abbott. I'm the manager for data analysis and dissemination here with EPELI and SDD.
I am Sandra. I work SDD Finance Administration. I'm here to listen for the first session for the poem.
Yeah. And I'm Mike Sharp. I'm an economist with SDD. So we're sitting here in the PhD meeting room, which doesn't necessarily mean we're all doctors. It actually stands for the Public Health Division meeting room. So not as smart as the name says, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's a useful distinction because we were all suitably impressed. Okay, so I think we'll get into it pretty soon, but we're basically so we've brought 2 3-hour sessions. Apart from apparently Kristen, who I saw in one of the agenda items was somehow having a 4-hour session while we were all having 3-hour sessions. So that intrigued me greatly. I wondered.
I have to stay after school. I've been bad.
Yeah. I thought being from New York, you might have done the same thing in 2 hours. That was the way around I would have expected it to have gone. Okay, so today essentially 2 sessions with a 10-minute break. And you've had the agenda items, but so we'll just see how it goes. Probably a good idea to stay muted unless you're talking. There's new Zoom rules. I don't know, Mike, if you've had any experience with these meetings of trying to use the chat. No, I have had. That's a good place to put stuff in there if people either want to make it clear. There's something they want to talk about. So we'll, I'm sure, Mike, you'll look in the chat. I'll try and look in the chat from time to time just to see if people are putting things in there. Apart from that, we'll just see how we do. Very conscious, for me, this is quite a long Zoom meeting. Obviously, like everybody in the world, I've been having a lot of Zoom meetings. Not quite. Oh, look, there we go. Mike's put, welcomed everybody into the chat. Okay. So anyway,
Vince, yep. Just sorry to add, to let everyone know the meeting's being recorded, and yeah, it's best to, like you say, mute your microphone if you're not talking, and if you want to contribute, there's an option to raise your hand. So I think if you click, how do you do that? I'm not sure how to do it, but there is an option, but otherwise you can write. There you go. Kristen's worked it out. So maybe she's raised and lowered her hand. See if you can work it out, but I think we can keep it quite informal, hey? We can interrupt and keep it relatively simple.
Okay. Well, it's right. Okay. So let's see how we get on. We'll go straight into the first session maybe, which is international development of the IDA project. And Mike and Alan, you're going to lead us through this.
Yeah, so I'll just lead off with an introduction to the project. But Alan introduced himself, so we've engaged Alan to help us to develop our project operations manual for the project, the PACSTAT project, so Statistical Innovation and Capacity Building in the Pacific Islands. We've talked about this at previous PSMB meetings, but I'll still give a brief rundown of the project, which was officially live as at around sort of mid-June. So we've met all of the bank's kind of pre-financing requirements, with the exception of one, which is the writing of the project operations manual. And the methods board has a significant role in the project operations manual, and we're seeking input at this time to get some feedback so that Alan and I, as we develop the project operations manual, can put the methods board input into the manual itself. So I'll start off just with a brief introduction of the project, and then I'll talk about the results framework really briefly. But the reason I'm going to do this is because it highlights the important role that the methods board plays in the project and the project deliverables. And then we'll talk a little bit about the project operations manual and open the floor for discussion. Alan and I have some specific questions that we'd like to ask in regards to the manual itself, and sort of some decision-making processes that may or may not be required, but we'll come to that later on in the presentation. So the overall, I'm going to see if I can, there we go. That looks better. I've covered the SPC logo. So, okay, so the development objective is to improve the quality of welfare data collection and accessibility to comparable welfare data in the Pacific Island countries. So we've obviously got Kristen and Darian on the call, so I'd like to acknowledge them. They were our main counterparts at the bank, as well as Tofik, who's not on the call, who effectively helped us to develop this project and to get the funding. So thanks to the World Bank for that. The project runs for 5 years, so from now until June 2025, and it has three sort of main components. So the first component, and once again I highlight the importance of the methods board in this project, and the first component is really all about supporting the Pacific Statistics Methods Board, and I'm going to talk more about each component later on. The second is about institutional strengthening and implementation support, so that's really supporting SPC and SDD in particular to strengthen us as a technical assistance provider to the Pacific Island countries and territories in data production, particularly relating to welfare statistics, and also harmonization and dissemination of welfare data. And the third component's on alternative data collection methodologies. So this, the SDD, or the Statistics for Development Division component of the IDA regional program, is one component of the IDA regional program, and there are currently another two sort of sister projects. So Tonga and Kiribati have also recently had approval for IDA funding, and they're going through a similar process to what we're going through here at SDD in developing a project operations manual. But the projects are somehow standalone in nature, but they are complementary as well. So the Tonga and Kiribati projects are about household income and expenditure surveys and prices. So it's funding sort of the conduct of surveys, it's funding institutional strengthening initiatives, it's funding, I'm not sure in Tonga, but I know for sure in Kiribati it's funding expansion of the collection of consumer price indices. And in effect, the SDD, the Tonga and the Kiribati project, despite being somehow standalone in nature, they will be complementary to one another. And in fact, some of the performance indicators of the SDD component of the project, some of the performance indicators of SDD depend on successful implementation of the projects in Tonga and Kiribati. So they are interrelated in that way. And there's a link where you can find a whole bunch of project documentation. So to dive a little bit more deeply into the three components, I'm actually really happy for this first component because I'm sure you're all aware that I'm largely responsible for sort of the secretariat function of the methods board. But under the PACSTAT project, we'll be hiring a statistics advisor who will actually dedicate 60% of their time to support and administration of the Pacific Statistics Methods Board. So they're going to be taking on the role of the basic stuff like meeting, organisation, agendas and inviting people, which I clearly failed on today because we're missing two of our member countries. And we also, that person will be responsible for coordination of papers and reports and identifying topics for further review at other methods board meetings and preparation of minutes, etc. So basic sort of secretariat function of the methods board. But in this project, or in this component of the project, we've also got a funding envelope to support PSMB's function to promote sort of statistical best practice in the Pacific region. And so what we're calling this is PSMB commissioned work. And this relates to any sort of research topics that are identified during the methods board's meeting, where we might say like, that's something that's of importance to the Pacific region and of importance to the production of welfare statistics in the Pacific region. So how can we sort of define a research question and how can we, I guess, identify a way forward for answering that research question? So I think in I guess, in more simple terms, we have a funding envelope to engage contractors or to conduct general research in statistical development for the Pacific region. So these PSMB commissioned works will, I mean, if I think back to previous meetings of the methods board, we talked about looking at identification of microdata anonymisation in small island developing states, which is obviously complicated because of the small populations and the relatively large sampling fractions in the Pacific. We talked about identifying appropriate adult equivalency factors in the Pacific for use as opposed to like per capita or as opposed to globally agreed conversion factors. So, you know, these sorts of research questions where we say like, hey, this is something that's important, but we need to do a literature review or we need to do a survey of people. We have an envelope for PSMB to sort of commission those sorts of research. Now, the project operations manual requires that we have a decision-making process established in the methods board for how those commissioned works are decided and reviewed and how the results are disseminated to our member countries. So we'll come back to that at the end of this presentation. And then the other component the other part of component one is dissemination of best practice. So this is dissemination of feedback from some of these PSMB commissioned works or recommendations from PSMB to our member countries. So it's supposed to have a strong emphasis on implementation rather than theory. So looking at like using the sampling guidelines as an example. So through PSMB, we developed the sampling guidelines and then, you know, in partnership with the bank and Stats New Zealand, we've actually gone and done practical training with our member countries to implement those guidelines. So it could be sampling guidelines, it could be training in the implementation of different survey modules, so food away from home modules, or 7-day recall consumption modules, so it could be training in that. It could be training in the results of the anonymisation commissioned work. So we have an envelope effectively. If PSMB says, okay, we make this recommendation for the region, then the statistics advisor and SDD we have now resources to support the dissemination and training in those recommendations by the methods board. Okay, so moving on to component 2. So this is really strengthening SDD's capacity, and in particular our capacity in welfare data collection, analysis and dissemination, or poverty statistics in essence. So the component consists of things like providing technical assistance and training to our member countries. So you will have seen in the agenda that tomorrow we have a session on the Pacific Poverty Guidelines. So once those guidelines are endorsed by the methods board, then a role under this project will be for us to provide training in the implementation of those guidelines, and that can be the implementation ranging all the way from like production of data right through to analysis and publication of poverty statistics. The next part is to harmonise key welfare indicators. So this is essentially to start to produce comparable poverty indicators of SPC's member countries over time and across space. So that'll be preparing comparable indicators from one survey to the next within country, but also preparing comparable indicators across the Pacific Island countries and territories. So we'll be able to compare poverty rates and derivatives of between our membership. And then finally is to just update a roster of consultants. So we actually have a fairly limited pool of go-to consultants who provide technical assistance to the Pacific region in relation to conduct of household income and expenditure surveys and use of those data. And so we just want to establish a pool of consultants that we can draw on because SPC's capacity is not infinite, and we can't keep up with the current load of work to support our members. There's also some sort of institutional strengthening components. So there's some cash allocated to buy our time for managing the project and providing technical input to the project. There's also some cash to improve our conferencing facilities at SPC, and this is particularly important under the current COVID climate because we're going to be looking, I guess, at increasing our delivery of technical assistance and training via video conferencing facilities. So to implement this component, we're hiring a welfare economist for 4.5 years, and 60% of their time will be allocated to this component. And we're also contracting a harmonization advisor for 3 years, and they'll be entirely dedicated to this component of the project. The final component is looking at alternative data collection methods in the Pacific region. So this is really about innovative methods for the collection of data and data that are complementary to conduct poverty analysis. So the methods board's well aware of what we did in the Marshall Islands, where we conducted an experiment to test the most efficient ways to produce consumption data in the context of the Pacific region. And this is sort of continuing those sorts of experiments. So we envisage that the methods board commissioned work will be sort of relatively smallish contracts, whereas the innovative experiments will be sort of larger, more comprehensive kind of rigorous experimentation of different methodologies. So the objective of these experiments is to reduce the cost or reduce the complexity of collecting socioeconomic data in the Pacific. And we've talked again at previous methods board meetings about some ideas, and they could range from things like using satellite imagery to conduct household listings. They could range to using computer-assisted telephone interviews, so effectively phone telemarketing centres to collect data, and session 2 of today's more dedicated to that concept. But look, once again, the decision on the PSMB commissioned work and the decision on the innovative experiments will involve the methods board. So any sort of topics that are presented to the methods board from our membership or that are raised during meetings of the methods board could be considered for either commissioned work or innovative experiments. And today what we're hoping to get out of the discussion after my presentation is an idea around the decision-making processes that will come into play for the methods board. The resourcing for this component is that we have $950,000 US for the experiments themselves. And then we also have 40% of the time of both the statistics advisor and the welfare economist to conduct the experiments, to develop them, implement, prepare the reports, and broadly disseminate the results. So that's the summary of components 1, 2 and 3 of the project. And this is sort of just the theory of change, which I don't think I'll talk to in a great amount of detail at all today, but if you wanted to sort of, I guess, understand how we get from the project activities to the low level and the mid-level outcomes, then you can have a more detailed look at this. And then once again, looking at the results and monitoring framework, I won't go through this in a huge amount of detail either, but I've highlighted in green the results and monitoring indicators that are related to the methods board. And you can see it's across 2 pages. I'll just flick to page 2, of which there are none on page 2. But you can see on page 1 there, components, a lot of the indicators are related to the methods board. So once again, the methods board is really central to the project. So the first indicator is the guidance notes approved and disseminated. So these could be when the methods board commissions a work on, say, anonymisation practices, then the project would, based on the methods board recommendation, produce a guidance note for the Pacific Island countries and territories. So that would be 1 out of 10 of the deliverables under that component of the project. And then, the second indicator is the number of experiment reports. So this is a performance indicator to see if we actually were successful in conducting innovative experiments and producing reports for communicating the results to our membership. So once again, they would be reports submitted to the methods board, and over the 5 years we're aiming to do 2 reports. So I'll skip through these next 2 slides, and just to once again highlight the role of the methods board, you can see this sort of flow diagram where the first box on the top left talks about PSMB commissioning reviews. So this is our commissioned work, or PSMB commissioning innovative experiments. And so if they commission a desktop review, that would fall under component 1.1, where SPC here would go through the review. We'd probably either do it ourselves or engage a contractor to do the review. When we meet, the methods board would decide whether it wants to commission any new work, and it would also then review any submitted papers that are produced from the commissioned work. And then similarly, looking at component 3, the process is effectively the same. We would conduct an experiment and then submit the results of the experiment to the methods board for consideration and review and recommendation. And then the recommendations would be communicated to our membership via trainings and workshops and things, and then via implementation of those recommendations. So you can see once again the methods board plays a really critical role in this project. And I think I forgot to mention as well that if you'll recall to the October meeting, the methods board approved for the IDA project to be a standing agenda item. So we're sort of stuck with this project for the next 5 years, and it's going to be discussed at every meeting of the methods board, which I think you'll see is super important given the role of the methods board. So, okay. Okay. Oh yeah, so that's what I just spoke about. Yeah, so this is sort of the summary of the role of the methods board, and it's related to the KPIs of the project. So, you know, the functioning of the PSMB is important, and one of the KPIs to measure this is that the methods board meets twice per year. So that's a KPI for us. We've talked about the commissioned work, but you know, the methods board will be responsible for identification of research. It will request for submissions from SPC as the secretariat. It will select the research. It will perhaps guide the TOR development. It will monitor progress. It will review and endorse the findings. And it will also make recommendations based on the findings of the research. PSMB will be responsible for advocacy of statistical best practice in the Pacific region. It'll have a role in component 2 in terms of defining methodologies and approaches for conducting poverty analysis in the Pacific region, which again we'll talk more about tomorrow morning. It'll advocate again for statistical best practice in harmonization, standardization initiatives, and similarly to component 1, the methods board will play a role in requesting proposals for innovative experiments. It'll be responsible for selecting the experiments that we implement, guiding TOR, monitoring progress, reviewing and endorsing findings, and then making recommendations based on the research, and then once again advocating for implementation of recommendations that are endorsed for the Pacific to adopt that will meet the objective of more cost efficient and statistically rigorous methods for the Pacific region to adopt. Okay. When we come to the project operations manual, so really like we can't do anything yet for this project. I mean, we can come up with some ideas around what we would like to do for components 1 and 3, but something that's a criteria for SPC to complete before we're able to access the funds is to write this project operations manual. And so it's a really essential activity, and the purpose of this session is to get PSMB's input into the manual, and I've highlighted the components of the manual that are relevant to the methods board. But really the manual is going to be sort of the Bible for the project. So if we're doing a commissioned work, it should clearly spell out, you know, how does the methods board make the decision on what work it is to commission. So is it going to be a vote? Is it going to just be a mutually agreed decision, or another mechanism to make a decision? It'll talk about, yeah, like the details for how proposals for experiments or commissioned works are presented to the methods board. It'll talk about the cycle that'll occur from, you know, once a proposal is submitted to the methods board. You know, how long does the methods board need to review those proposals? How does the methods board make a decision? What's the methods board involvement in the development of the TORs, the monitoring and evaluation of the experiments, et cetera, et cetera. There's also some safeguard instruments in the project that we need to develop. So there is one of the safeguards is a stakeholder engagement plan. So that's a plan that's really more defined for when we engage our member countries in the conduct of in-country experiments. But as I was developing this presentation, I sort of thought that the methods board is a stakeholder, and it should probably also then be included somehow in the stakeholder engagement plan. So that's something maybe more for Alan and I to talk about offline, but I thought I'd raise that here. Again, there's something that is required in the project operations manual in terms of monitoring, reporting, communication, etc. And so we will have to define a strategy for how PSMB's recommendation and findings are communicated to our membership. And we need some information on eligibility criteria for conducting the experiments in country. So, you know, one of the easy examples of eligibility criteria is that the Pacific Island country that is conducting or hosting the experiment has to be an IDA eligible country. And once again, we're going to develop some templates, some guidelines, some procedures for the PSMB to follow in relation to commissioning work or selecting, evaluating innovative experiments. Okay, so that's sort of the project summary. And Alan has very kindly put together some of these guiding notes on to help the discussion this afternoon. And Alan, in a minute, I'll invite you to intervene to clarify anything that I might have missed if you'd like. But I'll just quickly run through. There's 3 slides to propose discussions. And the first is looking at the component deciding on PSMB commissioned work. So these are the things that the project operations manual will need to specify. And this is what we'd like to talk about in the session, the remainder of the session this morning. So the next part is deciding on the suitability, the suitable experiments. So it's very similar. So the commissioned work and the experiments, I guess the processes will ideally be very similar. I think it would be a bit silly if we have one process for the commissioned works and one process for the experiments. So hoping we can keep things relatively simple there. And then the next page is just on, you know, questions on whether you'd like to change the way we're operating in terms of our technical support and administration of the methods board, any other comments, questions we can have, and then whether we're in a position today or tomorrow to start to look at what would be the first in commissioned work and what would be the first innovative experiment. So I'll just take you back to the first slide of the discussion. And if you'll allow me, Mr. Chair, I'll just invite Alan to intervene before we open the floor. So Alan, if you've got any comments, please go ahead.
Thanks, Michael. You've covered it pretty thoroughly. The one comment I would make is that essentially the reason behind the need for a procedures project, a POM, I'll call it, is essentially to ensure that we have some consistency, some transparency and accountability in the way we operate, or the work we do, the procedures we have. And the important thing that Michael alluded to is that really we can't spend much of IDA's money on this until the World Bank has approved the POM. So hence the urgency of trying to get the POM put together. That's the only thing I would add to what Michael has already said. Now, how do we want to run the discussion? I'll let the chair look after that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose the main thing is to try and figure out. So, you know, we'd sort of said we'd go from now to something like, well, another half an hour or so, a bit more. And in that time, I suppose the challenge is to try and figure out what are the most useful principles that enable you to crystallize this detail, right? Because clearly a group like this is not going to sit around and design some process in detail, right? I mean, we're going to look at what something you prepare and react to it. So I'm imagining that what you want are big ballpark directions. This sort of, you know, this sort of thing, not the other sort of thing. Is that what you're most useful? I mean, what would actually be most useful? I mean, did you have, if there was three things that this discussion could clarify through you, what would they be?
Well, you're right. I don't want answers to everything today, but I want some information on your current procedures, for example. I know you haven't been operating all that long, but do you have procedures for reviewing documents or whatever? Similar sort of procedures might be used for evaluating things. I guess a few things might be useful. I mean, for example, in commissioned work and experiments, who is able to submit proposals for that? Is it just PSMB members or the SDD, or is it wider than that? Do you have pro formas? If not, what I'm hoping to get today is a little bit of information on how you would operate and what you would be looking at, and then I'll prepare some procedures and some pro formas and run them past the members through Michael.
Yeah, and I think what Alan and Vince have both articulated is right. Like, we're not obviously looking for very, very detailed, concrete stuff today. It's really just a discussion, and Alan described it well. But what we will be proposing tomorrow, Vince, is that we have another methods board interim meeting at the end of August, and at that time we can present back to you the POM addressing these discussion items. So today will be, I guess, more overarching guidance, and the next methods board meeting, which we hope you'll agree to having in the end of August, we'll be looking at the details and adjusting and tweaking the details at that point in time. So over to you, Vince.
So yeah, look, so there's a bit of discussion about the type of input that Alan and Mike are looking for. So I'll open up the floor for contributions and discussions. So now, so just launch in. If there's someone wants to talk, just launch in. Don't wait for me to go to ask you to talk, because I suspect that with this process thing, this is quite a hard thing to respond to. So first of all, does anybody want to make any reactions to what they've heard? No. Oh, this is going to be a slow discussion.
May I?
Of course.
Ask me for being a bit late. Been having some connectivity issues. So I think the question that was raised earlier, who can submit the experimental, well, methodologies or proposals, I think it's an interesting one. Whether it be SDD or whether it be individual countries wanting to undertake some experimental statistical collection or methodologies. Would it be in the arena of, say, educational institutions such as USP or CAP to undertake those? I mean, we've had the PSMB has had its hand in designing or conceptualizing those courses as well. That's just my question. In addition to that,
Okay, thanks, Sapir. Nice to have you on board. Thanks for finding your way into the meeting. Much appreciate that you persisted. Others?
So I think we should allow submission of proposals for both the commissioned work and the experiment from any stakeholders. So I think it would allow our membership, so the Pacific Island countries and territories, to submit proposals. As Ipia mentioned, it could also allow development partners, so USP, the Statistical Institute of Asia Pacific, SCAP, UNICEF, others to make proposals. And also I would hope that it would also allow SPC to make proposals. So I imagine I'm proposing that the proposals could come from sort of any member or stakeholder. Obviously, if the proposals are way outside the scope of the project, then some of the decision-making processes of PSMB will ensure that we don't conduct commissioned work or experiments that are beyond the scope of the project. So that will need to be put in place. But I think we could perhaps come up with a template for submitting proposals, and it could just be a relatively simple sort of template that would outline the need for the work or the experiment, the objective, the research question to answer, and perhaps like a summary of the activities that would need to be undertaken to implement the commissioned work or the experiment. So, I mean, this is what I'm, I guess, putting forward to the methods board. Firstly, would we agree to allow for proposals from SPC's membership and our partners? And secondly, would we agree to developing a basic template for proposers to fill for submission to PSMB?
Okay, so maybe we might put that as a question, see if there's other things that people want to raise as questions or issues, and then sort of work through some of them as we go. Are there other issues that people occurred to people as Mike and Alan were presenting?
Well, just a quick comment, sort of following on from the discussion that's just had. I think we need to be clear whether the PSMB is commissioning work or whether we're assessing and evaluating proposals. To my way of thinking, if we're getting proposals lodged with us, we're not really commissioning work. We're evaluating proposals and saying what we think and making a judgment on the merits of proceeding with that proposal. The board doesn't control the budget either, so we're not paying for this work. Now look, I'm very happy with the idea of getting proposals and assessing them, but I just think we need to be clear whether our role is an evaluation role or a commissioning role.
Okay, that's well, can we just hold that one? That sounds like a good topic to be clear about and discuss. Are there other issues that occurred to people on the way through?
Yeah, if I could just jump in, Vince. Sorry, I mean, Mike made me a co-host at the start, so I don't know how to put up my hand, so I'm just going to have to jump in.
Go for it.
So, no, I mean, just because the issue of USP and CEAP came up, and like CEAP falls under SCAP, so I'll speak more on behalf of CEAP, but I wouldn't necessarily envisage CEAP putting forward proposals, but they could be in a good position to support proposals from the training perspective. So I'd just like to flag that, and I'll certainly take this forward with CEAP to get their views on that. So yeah, CEAP more supporting proposals from a training perspective.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Other comments, particularly, I don't know, Kimwelly or Viliami, any thoughts?
We're actually having a chat among us here, and I think Bruce's question as to whether component 1 is PSMB commissioning work and component 3 is receiving proposals. I think it's a good one. I'm not sure, Alan or Kristen, or Darian for that matter, do you guys, have I interpreted the project documentation correctly to say that proposals should be provided for both component 1 and 3, or is it only component 3 where proposals should be provided?
So technically this is where my observer status comes in. I'm not supposed to weigh in because I'm not supposed to influence the functioning of a World Bank project. So this is advice that you don't have to follow. I'm not speaking on behalf of the World Bank. I'm just I think you can organize it however you want to organize it. I think if the poem lays out a way for SPC to sort of take the lead and act very independently with the PSMB just kind of as in an endorsing role, I think we would be okay with that. If they want to center it much more, the decision-making process in the PSMB, I think we would be okay with that too. As long as there's a process laid out and it's very clear as to where kind of the responsibility rests. Because you think about a situation where, if an experiment doesn't, if something collapses, right, which we don't anticipate happening, but if it does collapse, the blame will fall on SPC, right? And so, we probably don't want to be in a situation where the PSMB can ask for something absolutely insane and then SPC is in the position of having to deliver or basically facing the consequences. So I think, there has to be a little bit of, I don't want to call it veto power, but a role for SPC to sort of make a decision as to whether what they're doing, what's proposed is feasible. But I think also at the same time, the PSMB is such a good resource that it would be a waste not to take advantage of it to the fullest extent possible. That's my non-answer.
Okay. No, that's appreciated that you give dispassionate, helpful guidance, Kristen. That's a useful thing for you to do.
Vince, may I make a comment here?
Of course. Go on.
There is perhaps a compromise in this sort of discussion we're having, and that, SPC is obviously the major player here and has a lot of contact with countries and with partners. So maybe there's an option where SPC seeks ideas from countries and partners on experiments or commission work or review work that needs to be done. And then SPC is responsible for providing submissions, if you like, to PSMB, and PSMB makes decisions on them one way or the other. That might simplify the process as well. I mean, even if that's not the case, if it's just open slather, then SPC still needs to have a filtering role before anything goes to PSMB. So that may be an option. Just a thought.
Okay. My sense, what I was also wondering if you were getting at, Bruce, was there's a sense that if the PSMB is commissioning things, then that means that PSMB has to have some notion of what matters most to it. It has to have some idea of biggest problems that need a solution, or biggest opportunities that it seems like we're going to fulfill. I mean, because this would, in my head, it's almost like you need some sort of agenda of where you want to get to. I was interested in the whole notion of how in fact it was sort of implied, I think, by your first question, Alan, which is, what do we need to have more structure and discipline about how we do things because we start engaging with this opportunity? Because presumably, so it sort of felt like whether it's through SPC or through PSMB, this notion of what matters most, or what are the problems that need solution, and then there's something about if SPC is going to essentially undertake the function of managing the experiment, that they take on the role of trying to figure out how to identify or scale something that's a feasible activity within the bounds of what they're promising to do.
So I sort of see that there's potentially three streams for identification of potential research, and they could come from our membership and partners. They could come from SPC, so we might identify something and present and propose that to PSMB. But then PSMB, and this falls more into the commissioned work theme, is that PSMB at a meeting could say like, hey, that's a research idea that's important, and then PSMB would direct SPC to develop the proposal to present back to PSMB at the subsequent meeting. So I think the three-stream approach might be interesting, and in the stakeholder engagement plan, it could be that we establish a mechanism for SPC's members and partners to make proposals to SDD, who would then, I guess, filter them and make the proposals to the methods board. So the methods board wouldn't be inundated with proposals from, everyone in the Pacific. But then we would come to the point where we'd need to establish, how does SDD filter proposals that we deem worth pursuing or we deem outside the scope.
No, that's right. So, and presumably part of that filtering process is either because it's aligned to some sense of priority or greatest opportunity that have been identified through some process, whether it's PSMB discussion or something else. That's a filter, and the other filter is just is the sort of a feasibility sort of filter. Can you identify an activity that would create, a way ahead, some clarity, or there's an actual method that you can test?
Just want to jump in there a bit. My view on this is that the PSMB should be guided by the current TIPS strategy at the moment, but with the experimentation, I think that should be open to anybody. The filtering process would have to consider, probably the greatest possible impact to the countries themselves. I mean, one of the dangers of, say, opening it up to, say, development partners is that they prioritize their own issues rather than the country issues. That's my view on that. And I think that's what SDD should always consider, their member countries first and foremost. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The only other thing I've been confused about with this process is, and this may be a technicality, and apologies if I've got things out of perspective, but on the way through there was some mention that countries had to be IDA eligible to get the benefits of this. And I remember we talked about this on a previous occasion. Can someone just clarify what is and isn't a constraint about that?
I think I'll jump in. So the experiments can only be conducted in IDA eligible countries, and any training or dissemination that's using our project funding can only benefit IDA eligible countries, but it doesn't preclude us from engaging or including other non-IDA countries in the training, but it just means that we can't pay for them under the IDA project. So in summary, experiments need to be conducted in IDA eligible countries, and we can't spend money on training non-IDA eligible countries using our project money, but we can include them using other SPC resources.
Right.
Yeah. So it's limited, but I think given our membership, we have a view that it will be all inclusive of our membership. Can I just, I guess, you know, we've got some pretty helpful information on like submission of proposals. Can I just talk a little bit about sort of the way we have worked previously in the decision-making process? So previously for the Household Income and Expenditure Survey experiment, and for tomorrow, we're also presenting the results of sort of an experimental type research. But the Methods Board has been briefed on the results, well, the conduct of the experiment. They've been briefed on the results by international recognised experts who have also made recommendation to the board for endorsement. I mean, is this as the status quo acceptable under the IDA project? And I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, if we do run a innovative experiment, is it acceptable that SDD and or other technical partners will just simply present the results to the Methods Board, and the Methods Board will collectively agree whether to adopt or reject or ask for more information in terms of the recommendation? Or do we want to go through a process whereby we have a quorum, or how do you think we should make the decisions based on recommendations in relation to commissioned work and the experiments?
Okay, is there anybody who has a strong view about that?
Well, I don't have a strong view, but go ahead, Pia.
Go ahead, Bruce. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
On the how part, I think we should have a clear guidelines on the direction that we are currently going. Goes back to our 10-year plan, which is supposed to be renewed probably sometime this year for the next 10 years. And I think that's where the countries would have to have a say in that, in that direction. I think that's where we could look at prioritizing areas that are identified in that strategy that are possibly linked with all the other strategies, individual strategies from each of the countries. What I haven't gotten my mind around yet is the experimental stuff. I think that's where your expertise will come in individually, and also your experiences in your own advanced systems. I think that's probably, I'm just making a suggestion, and I think that in the next phase or in the next 10-year plan that we are going to start developing, I think we have to look at that. But then we have to look back again at the current tips to understand where our current gaps are, and perhaps start filling them in terms of the experimental stuff to kickstart some of these gaps, or to address some of these gaps, particularly in this current environment and crisis. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Appear. So did I take out of what you're saying that you do see some sort of obligation on the methods board to crystallize those the goals of the 10 years plan, or however we do it, into something that makes the sort of priorities that we're looking for more apparent to people who might be looking to make some sort of submission to us? Is that part of what you're doing, you were suggesting? And then you're also suggesting, well, look, okay, obviously when it comes to new innovation things, that's the nature of those, is that you need to look at them as they come up, because there'll be opportunities or clever new ideas that people are that you need to assess against how likely they seem to be to solve the sort of problems or take opportunities that you've identified.
Yes, Vince. Yes.
No, that I'm mute. Sorry, I'm trying to be good about muting and unmuting, and I've confused myself. Now, Mike, you were also, though, to pick up what the question you asked us, you were concerned about the specific decision-making mechanisms of the methods board, weren't you? That was the question you had, which was essentially, do we need to put some extra work into formalising some of the decision-making processes, given that there's now going to be some need for traceable accountability in terms of the financial consequences of the decision? Was that the sort of issue that you were raising?
Well, it's more, and I'll use the example of anonymisation processes. It's more like, let's say we engage a person who's an expert in anonymisation, and they make a broad sweeping extreme recommendation to say that the population of the Pacific Island countries are too small for microdata to be disseminated, and we recommend that microdata is kept under lock and key and never released for secondary analysis. So to me, this is extreme, and it's counteractive to statistical development in the region. So if that's the recommendation to PSMB, what's the process for us to endorse, reject, or other? That's what I'm interested in, and I'm looking back at the HIES experiment where we sort of all presented the results, and we asked a few questions, and if the board was generally in agreement with the results and the recommendation, then we said, okay, we think that that's important, so we endorse and we recommend that result or recommendation. Whereas, what's the process? If something comes back to be super extreme, how do we go through the decision-making process? Do we keep it informal and just have the board come to a mutual agreement, or is there another way that we need to really more formally document the decision-making process? And I'm happy with the current status, if that helps.
Well, okay, so you've clarified the question you were asking, so I'll try and refrain as chair from continually offering my own view. So I'm very keen for others who have views to express them, please.
Look, I don't want to overly dominate the conversation either, but although, I don't have a strong view, getting back to what Vince said a little while ago, but it seems to me the model we've sort of fallen into so far, as you sort of say, Mike, is somebody somewhere is a champion for a particular idea. You know, as somebody really wants to get something done, they come to the methods board with a paper, and indeed we have some of these papers coming up later in the meeting, making recommendations, and we talk about it, and we come to a view. Now, maybe one thing you're asking perhaps is what happens if a consensus can't be reached, and you know, maybe we have to cross that bridge at some time. But I suspect probably the path of least resistance is to sort of fit in with the mode of working we've already developed, which is along the lines, you know, what you said, where someone comes up with a paper with recommendations, and you seek the board's view on those recommendations or the work more generally. Just while I've got the floor, and then I'll shut up. But look, I agree with IPEA that it's a role of the board to set priorities, and that's already in our terms of reference. That's there, and that's what we should be doing. But it seems to me that the practice, you know, is that there are going to be people who want to get a certain thing done or a certain change of direction, and they're going to come to the board with recommendations. And it seems to me, so based on our experience so far, that that's just going to happen, and we're going to continue to be evaluating and sharing our views on these sorts of projects.
Thanks, Bruce. Other views? My own sense, for what it's worth, is that it sort of depends a lot on what the consequences of what's been proposed is. I mean, it's one thing if it's a discussion on the feasibility of executing something we all want to have happen a certain way. But you know, the example you gave of the microdata access, Mike, that's quite a that's a little bit more fundamental in terms of the scope of service and an agency can provide. And that's a challenging question that we clearly haven't really had to face yet, in terms of whether or not, and also, as Bruce said, if there's really some strong differences of opinions about the way ahead, bearing in mind, of course, that we're looking to be helpful to a group of sovereign nations who ultimately can all make their own choices about how to do things. In terms of what we've talked about before in the methods board, but I suppose that where the consequences of the decision are more material, we need to maybe that is we'll have to say, okay, look, we've got genuine disagreements, so we may have to document whatever we do decide a little more carefully, and you know, have a little bit of a second round at it if there's some sense of we found it hard to make that decision.
Sorry, Vince, can I just make a comment here? I think we should remember that we do have a terms of reference for the PSMB. So yep. I think that's something that we should refer to make sure that whatever we agree or decide on here today is actually in compliance with the terms of reference. And if we were to decide on something different, then we would need to maybe revise the TOR. So yeah, it's a two-way process, I think.
No, that's a good point. If I wondered, you know, how that if we that having this opportunity may leave us with challenges in terms of the way we've been operating, and that's and so that's a great point. Thanks, David. I'm conscious that we are coming to the end of the time that we said we would allocate to this discussion. So I want to give Mike and Alan the chance to identify things that they had wanted to discuss that haven't been covered at all, or if there's something we have discussed and they think, look, you're 80% of the way to giving us useful advice, and a little bit of extra attention to that might have actually been, you might have finally been helpful to identify what those would be before we close the discussion down.
Yeah, thanks, Vince. If you don't mind, Alan, I might just sort of try and synthesize the conversation in relation to these points, and then you can jump in if you want some follow-up answers, if that's all right. So I think for the timetable for submitting proposals to PSMB, I'm not sure if it's explicit in our terms of reference, but I think that the current status quo is that papers are submitted to PSMB 2 weeks in advance of the meeting. I wonder if I propose that we collectively agree that any proposals coming to PSMB need to be submitted 2 weeks in advance of the meeting. Secondly, in terms of the guideliners / pro forma for preparation of submission, I think that Alan and I should work on a basic template. I'm wondering if we can establish a mechanism that SPC will email our members, a month or 2 months before a PSMB meeting to say, like, proposals for commissioned work or proposals for experiments are open for the next 6 weeks. Here's the template that you need to fill. I think if we talk about the assessment criteria, I think IPIA has made some really good points that we do need to align with current regional strategies. So we could have some mechanism whereby the SDD does some initial screening, and we can consider the project objectives, we can consider tips, we can consider previous guidance from the methods board in screening proposals prior to submitting them to the methods board. I propose that if, the methods board has a relatively limited input to the TOR, no input to the hiring of consultants. Basically, SPC provides a reporting mechanism each meeting to the methods board to report on progress of experiments and work, and that the methods board is more involved in review / endorsement of outputs. Now, coming to sort of Bruce's question as to what happens if we can't come to a consensus, and IPIA is making some really good inputs to the chat. I wonder if the methods board cannot make a decision, if then we should just escalate the decision through the regional governance framework. So the decision, if PSMB can't land on a yes or no, that the recommendation would then be for the Pacific Statistics Standing Committee to review, and then if they can't make a decision, then it would go to HOPS to make a decision. I mean, that gives us an opportunity to escalate through the regional governance framework if the methods board can't land on a yes or no. And in terms of communication, I don't think we've probably got time to cover that, so that might be something that we come back to in August if we have another meeting. And look, I'll put it there, and I'll hand over to Alan to see if he's got any follow-up questions.
Thanks, Mike. I took a lot of notes during that process, and essentially my thinking is very similar to yours. There might be a couple of minor areas where it's slightly different, but I think I really appreciate the input we've had from you today, and I think it's given me enough to progress and to make some progress some work on the POM, and to be able to put something to you hopefully in August, which is a fairly well completed draft for comment. So thank you very much.
Okay. Are people happy to leave it there, or are there any things that people are concerned about that they want to make clear as guidance to Mike and Alan before we conclude that discussion? And I understand we can capture the chat, because Apia, thank you for the effort you're making in the chat there to provide input. That's much appreciated. Okay, well, I now have the happy duty of giving you 10 minutes off. We'll go to our next topic in 10 minutes time.
Well, during that time, I will leave the meeting. Thank you very much, Vince, and everyone
nice
for your thoughts.
Okay.
Cheers, Alan.
We'll talk again, I'm sure.
Is Jenny your partner, or I mean, you presumably know who Jenny?
Jenny's my wife. She's the boss, so her name goes on everything.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Bye, everyone. If I can work out how to get out of here.
Thanks a lot, Alan. Talk soon.
Okay. See ya.
While Kristen is doing her good work, it looks like she's had great success there. Okay, this is down as Kristen and David on the agenda, but we're handing over to you in the first instance, Kristen, are we?
I think that's the plan. I'm going to try to not talk for the full time allotted to me, because I'd like to leave space for questions and discussion. But I'm basically going to talk a little bit about our high-frequency mobile phone surveys in PNG and the Solomon Islands. We've run the first round in both places, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about, start with methodology, then do some findings starting in PNG, and then I will touch upon the Solomon Islands, but I just received the data there for this morning, so it'll be a very light touch. So first, talking about our Papua New Guinea survey, it was administered by Digicel from the Port Moresby call center. It worked out actually surprisingly well for us. We had not worked with Digicel before. We're more used to working with NSOs or survey firms, but we worked well with Digicel. They ran the call center, and they have a very large market share in PNG. They're 85% of all cell phone numbers with Digicel. And so we were able to use their subscriber roles as our sampling frame, and it's pretty close to representative with that level of market share. Our fieldwork dates ran from June 18th to July 2nd, and our questionnaire included a number of different types of information on the respondent, knowledge of COVID-19, employment and income loss for both our respondent and the household head, food access and food security, coping strategies, access to healthcare, public trust and security, and assets and well-being. And the last one, this assets and well-being, was actually kind of a monster section. The surveys were targeted to be 15 minutes because that's what both kind of the general survey literature on mobile phone surveys and kind of our best practice at the World Bank sets as the upper limit before people start not answering or start disconnecting. So this asset index it's almost half of my full 15-minute survey. And the reason we did that is because we want to recreate the DHS wealth index. And this is a major concern for these high-frequency mobile phone surveys because we expect heavy bias. The number of mobile phone connections in PNG, from the latest numbers that I could find, was equivalent to 32% of the total population. And that's assuming that everybody has only one number, which we don't think is the case. So it was really important to us to make sure we could recreate this DHS wealth index so that we could benchmark to the full distribution. Our sampling distribution, so we gave them a target, a sample size distributed across, the total sample size was 2,500. There's not really very good information in terms of the distribution of the population, so we matched to the DHS. So we just made sure that our distribution matched the DHS distribution. And we set those as the targets for Digicel. They hit the target almost everywhere. The last, West Sepik and Gulf, they came a little short. Gulf province is really the only place that they were substantially short. And as you can see, one of the fun challenges of random digit dialing is that it's very hard to control. So our National Capital District of Port Moresby, we got well over the number of responses that we were targeting. We were targeting I think 200 something, and we ended up getting many, many more. And that's because there's a disproportionate number of cell phone users in the capital. So taking a look at our demographic characteristics and comparing to the DHS, as you can see, the DHS is in blue, the high frequency survey is in orange. We have evidence of just a little bit of bias. Our sample is skewed heavily male. Our sample is much younger than the population distribution, and we have a much more educated sample than the population distribution in the DHS. So that was a concern. A bigger concern was this wealth index. And so as I mentioned, we recreated that wealth index, and then what I did is I took the deciles of the wealth index as calculated by the DHS, and I mapped those onto our high frequency survey. And as you can see, my data skews very heavily toward the upper end of the distribution. I have a very strong bias toward the top of the distribution. If you look at the mean of this particular variable, the weighted mean in the DHS is 0.08. The weighted mean, and here when I say the weighted mean, this is just the frequency weights. Total number of respondents versus total number of subscribers generated by Digicel. I get 0.405. So as you can see, that's not ideal, let's say. So when this data came in, I guess we got the data set on July 3rd, and then I spent the long holiday weekend trying to fix it. So after spending 3 days doing the best I possibly can with weights, I was able to balance out the characteristics, get the demographic characteristics to match up, and I was also able to more or less address the issues with the distribution. It's not perfect, but it's very close. For those of you that are familiar with CDF or community distribution function plots, you can see that my original was not a smooth curve. It didn't match very closely with the DHS, but once we reweighted the data, we're a little bit closer. It's not perfect, but I think in this case it's good enough for government work. And the weighted mean of the DHS wealth index, as I said, is 0.08, and the weighted mean of my high frequency wealth index now is 0.081. So it lines up quite a bit better than the initial findings. So I think that's kind of a quick run through of the methodological challenges that we have with these high frequency surveys. And so I think the main message here is that you are going to run into bias. These things are going to skew urban, they're going to skew educated, they're going to skew male, they're going to skew younger, and they're going to skew wealthier. And not to underestimate the challenge of addressing these issues with the weights. I like to think that I'm pretty good with weights. I've spent a couple of years doing this, and this was the most complicated set of weights that I've ever undertaken. So, not for the faint of heart. So now to the interesting part, looking at a couple of our quick results. So looking at information access, this is just, the sources of information. Almost everyone is getting information from friends and family and community leaders, but if you're looking at the main source of information, it's radio. So thinking about targeting messages and ways to get the message out about COVID-19 and different restrictions, radio seems to be the main source of information for the largest share of the population, but it is quite diffuse. Looking at changes in employment, so we have working at baseline, not working at baseline, working post-crisis, and not working post-crisis. And this includes both our respondents, and in the case where the respondent wasn't the household head, we also asked about the household head. So in some cases we have 2 respondents, and in some cases we have 1 respondent. But our analysis shows about 20% of people who are working at the pre-COVID baseline are not working now. And there's a small share, I think it's about 3.5% that was not working at baseline that is now working. Looking at the reasons that people stop working, a lot of it is kind of seasonal, which is we're assuming unrelated to the COVID crisis, but we do have workplaces closed, taking care of household members as other main reasons for stopping working. We are able to disaggregate this by male and female, so we can do sex disaggregated statistics. If you look at the reasons that men have stopped working, it's mainly the seasonality or their workplace is closed. If you look at the reason that women have stopped working, workplace is closed is also up there as a seasonality, but the main reason is that they are taking care of household members. So this we're able to do with our sample size, we're able to do disaggregation by sex. We can also do it by urban-rural. So if you look at urban areas, you can see that the restrictions are perhaps a little bit more important in terms of closures. We have workplaces closed, we have laid off, we have insufficient funds, and we have COVID-19 movement restrictions. Those are the top four in urban areas. In rural areas, there is workplaces closed, but we also have more seasonality effects taking care of family members. So this is just to show that we can do the disaggregation by urban-rural. We can do it by region too. We haven't done it yet, but we can with the sample size. Quick look at coping mechanisms. This kind of asks households, are you undertaking any coping mechanisms due to lost income from the COVID restrictions? And I think the one that's most policy relevant here is we have 56% of households reducing the number of children that are attending school. So this kind of shows that there's major impacts for educational attainment going forward if this is not addressed. And we've already been in early conversations with our education teams and social protection teams about how we can dig a little bit deeper into this in our next round. Healthcare avoidance, this is another thing that we look for in crisis situations. And again, we can split out by urban and rural areas. In urban areas, if you look at why people who needed healthcare didn't get that healthcare, more than half were afraid that they would become infected. Whereas if you look at rural areas, they're kind of more traditional economic means or economic restrictions, insufficient money, unable to travel, no medical personnel available. And then just touching quickly on the Solomon Islands, as I said, we just got this data set in this morning, so I haven't had a chance to do the weights yet. Our target sample size there was 2650. They delivered much closer to the expected sample size. Here our partner was Tebet Research. Generally, we worked pretty well with them. They're a very professional company. There were some pretty substantial delays in receiving our data. We were about maybe a week and a half later than we expected it, but it's fine. We did eventually get the data, and we are now in the process of starting the analysis, calculating weights. And again, you see I have many of the same problems in terms of bias, though it's not quite as severe as it is in PNG. I don't have the comparator DHS to put up yet because I'm still waiting for Douglas Kimmey to countersign my MOU for DHS access, but we hope to have those soon. But you can see again, it skews male, it skews younger, it skews more educated. So that's all the slides I have. I think, I could kind of take you through endless different cuts and slides of different sex and geographic disaggregated statistics, and I can definitely go down a rabbit hole about survey methodology and weights. But I thought it would be most useful to just kind of run through a couple of slides, just talking about kind of quick different types of things that we can do, and then open the floor to questions. If anyone wanted to know a little bit more about our experience or had specific questions on methodology or findings.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. So that's a great invitation for people who've got questions about what was done, and then maybe wider discussion after that. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's the idea, at least from my side, to kind of let people ask what they are most interested in. I can clarify any points. I mean, I'm happy to talk about cost. I'm happy to talk about time period. I'm happy to talk about what kind of support we needed to provide on our side. But I don't want to bore everyone to tears with all of those details if it's not relevant.
Okay, so questions for Kristen.
Can I jump in, Vince? Chris here.
Of course.
Yeah. No, I mean, thanks a lot for that presentation, Chris. And I found it really interesting, especially, the graphs you show to illustrate the response bias. I remember a little while ago you were talking about, the length of the time that it takes these interviews, and normally what happens with these new surveys, the interviewers or the people on the phones or whatever do get quicker as they get more familiar with the data being collected. Is that the experience that you've found in both cases in PNG and Solomons? As the fieldwork progressed, the time period was reducing, so there's not as great a concern there as what we initially thought?
So actually, that's what we expected. My rule of thumb is from the last day of piloting, you're gonna drop about a third in the first couple of days as people get used to the length of the questionnaire. That actually didn't happen here. In both cases, we had to shorten the questionnaire by randomizing sections because it didn't drop. And we had to do it in PNG after the piloting because it was just too long. And we were showing, despite adding additional days of piloting, we just were not showing any decrease in time length. And in the Solomon Islands, we actually had to do it a week into field work because the time, it didn't budge. And both us and the survey firm had expected to see this drop because, as you say, that's pretty common, and we didn't see it. I mean, we did see some, right? I think our post-piloting estimate was that they were running at about 21 minutes on average, and we expected that would be no problem to drop down to 15 or 16, and I don't think we ever got below 18 anywhere. And if you look at the distribution of the length of these interviews, I have some in the 30, 40-minute range and where I have the metadata in PNG. So, yeah, it didn't seem to work that way, and I was surprised as well because my prior was definitely that we were going to see a lot more improvement in terms of interview time.
Okay. Other questions for Kristen?
I'll jump in quickly. So you haven't shown confidence intervals, Kristen, but I like with the lower end of your distributions, very unrepresented, that probably does drive variance up a fair bit.
Yes. So we had hoped to I mean, we definitely have sample size issues in certain places. Yeah. We had originally wanted to do the analysis by deciles. We had to abandon that very early. Then we went to quintiles. We also have to abandon that because we just don't have enough observations. By time I'm realistically have enough observations that the standard errors are not laughable, I have to use the bottom 40%. That gets me up into the 370, 380 range in terms of observations. It's a simple random sample, so I don't have clustering problems, so that's a benefit. But I definitely, for the smaller groups where I have heavy weights, I'm not going to be able to talk about no education. I'm not going to be able to talk about, the lowest decile. I'm just not going to have enough observations. I'm fortunate that I have, 3,300 total. So I can do some disaggregation, but, it's not everything that I wanted. And we're in conversation with Digicel about how to approach this in the next round because we're going to run these quarterly. And so I think what we're going to do is use their revenue data because they have revenue data because these are all prepaids on how much people spend to top up their phones. And we'll use their revenue data to see if we can try to oversample the bottom of the distribution and do a little bit better.
Sure. So look, I understand it's a problem and you've done your best to fix it. But just with some of the comparisons you've shown, I wonder how much of the apparent difference is actually due to sampling error. I mean, it depends how we're probably boring everyone else. It depends how the variable of interest actually varies across, socioeconomic status. But
yes, what we'll do is we'll probably use. Yes, we'll use as we present the results and put the report together. We'll use coefficients of variation to determine what we can and can't. What we can and can't put out there. But, yeah. I think everything I have on the slides here, I'm pretty confident that we have enough observations, particularly like the one I have on this slide now with these individual level characteristics, because we have usually 2 observations in each household. I actually have 7,000 or 8,000 that I can use here. 5,000 or 6,000 that I can use here. So that's helpful. But yes, definitely, like our discussion as we're writing the outline this week is what we can and can't do in terms of in terms of having enough sample size to have reasonable confidence intervals.
I must admit that wasn't the least bit boring for me, but I may be not the right or judge of all of this. Other questions?
Can you guys hear us in here?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay, Vince, can I just ask Kristen, what was the non-response rate like, Kristen?
So we don't know. They're RDD surveys. So in PNG, with the way it worked is a machine started randomly calling numbers, and it didn't connect to a person until like a person picked up, and then it would be switched over to a live operator. So I think we've all gotten these calls where, you know, we pick it up, there's a click, and then it shifts over to a live person. And so that's what we used in PNG. So I have no idea what percentage of the calls went unanswered. In the Solomon Islands, I don't have that information, but I probably could get it from Tebet, because there they were working with a combination of their respondent opt-in lists. So, you know, they're a marketing firm, so they have a list of participants, and they combine that with RDD, and any person that answers for RDD is automatically included in their list for the next survey, and then phone numbers that are switched off or lost. I would anticipate in the Solomon Islands and in PNG they were pretty high, because we've been in conversations about our second round, and in both cases the panel aspect, because we had hoped to recontact the same people in the subsequent rounds to sort of, you know, do the best we can. As I just discussed, we have some issues with our confidence intervals, so the panel would obviously help us in terms of being able to draw inference. But you know, Digicel were pretty frank. They're like, look, people churn their numbers every 3 months, and we reassign them right away. There's no guarantee that if you get a number and you call that number back in 3 months, that one, that number is going to be working, and two, even if it is working, it's the same person answering. And then that enters into this huge nightmare for me, because obviously my identifier is the number. I don't have, you know, I have first names, but I don't have, you know, long detailed history to match these respondents. So we're kind of in conversation now about how we're going to address this going forward. And kind of, you know, drawing from the global experience, the World Bank has over 100 of these going on globally. And I think the global experience, what we've seen is we're starting to roll out second and third rounds, is that countries where you don't need to register your SIM card, where you can kind of buy a SIM card in a corner store and use it and then toss it, they have very high churning rates and very high non-response. In countries where, you know, you have to go down to the parliament, wait online for 3 days, donate, you know, get your blood taken and fill out paperwork in order to register your number, people keep those numbers for a long time. So it's kind of directly correlated with the arduousness of obtaining and registering your SIM card in terms of how much these numbers churn. As far as like response rates itself, we see, you know, globally the same thing that we see in household surveys. You get non-response most heavily at the top and the bottom of the distribution. At the bottom of the distribution, you have people that live in poor areas, people live in remote areas, they don't have coverage all the time, or they don't have the money to keep their phone charged. So you see high non-response there. And at the upper end of the distribution, I think we're all guilty of not answering surveys when people call. And I feel I always make an effort because I don't want to be the non-response as a survey person. But even I say no sometimes. So you kind of get it at either end of the distribution. I hope that answers.
It's Tracy here, just a follow-up question. Thanks for that, Kristen. I just wondered whether in future it might be possible to get that kind of information in terms of number of phone numbers dialed, how many of those were, you know, dead ends, etc. Then of those where you did get to speak to someone, how many of those declined to participate? So the conversion rate from when you do get a contact to a respondent, etc., might be helpful if Digicel or Tebet are able to, you know, produce some of those stats in terms of the other countries that might be considering this type of survey. Just
yes, I've asked Digicel, and the way that their machine works, it's an algorithm somewhere. So it's not readily accessible. They may be able to pull it out. TEBIT has it. Whether TEBIT will share it with me or not is kind of an open question, but I can at least ask for it.
And I think certainly the machine stops at a certain point, so the conversion rate for numbers they do dial and what the dropout rate there is in terms of how many replacements and things are needed to reach the targets or quotas would be useful to know as well. So it's a sort of step onwards, I guess, whether they're able to record that in future might
Yes, definitely. We're getting ready to put together the second contract because we did one contract for the first round. So all of these suggestions are good because we can include them in the next round contract.
Christine, Apelli here. Just a question. Did you offer incentives to the respondents?
Yes, every respondent received an incentive. They were notified by text that they could be called. So I guess in PNG, Digicel, of course, sent out a blast to all of their subscribers saying, hey, we may call you in the next 2 weeks if you pick up an answer. I don't know what the equivalent in Keno was, but it was about $1.70 US. And we paid about the same, I think a little bit more. I think it was $2 in the Solomon Islands as an incentive. And there, I don't think they had a text message blast, but they did hear in the first 10 seconds they're on the phone as we're trying to obtain consent, they were told they would receive an incentive.
Kristen, you said in the PNG you had a lot of problems with reweighting to get a reasonable distribution. What is happening with the Solomons? Are you relying on TEBIT to do the reweighting, or will you do that yourself?
So the Solomon Islands we just got this morning, but no, I'll do the weights myself. This is not something I trust a survey firm to do. Like I said, I've been doing this a long time. I've worked on a number of these phone surveys, and this is a particularly complicated case in these two countries because I don't have good baseline data. Both countries, the last HIES in PNG was 2009, the last one in the Solomon Islands was 2012, so I'm relying on DHS surveys, and the DHS survey in the Solomon Islands is, 5 years old, and I have to do, I'm doing, not to go too technical, but, I have propensity score weights based on, fourth power functions of the asset index followed by, Gregg estimator calibrations. It's something that, there's only a handful of people at the bank that I would trust to do this. So, in a situation where you were recalling numbers that were in a previous survey, maybe the survey firm could do it with a little bit of hand-holding on how to set up a propensity score model. But generally, no, this is kind of a specialist activity, and you just wouldn't find those skills in kind of your standard marketing firm because they just don't have this issue.
So looking forward, if we were to do this in other countries, would we likely experience the same situation, that we would simply need to get the raw data from TEBIT or another survey firm and give it to you to do the reweighting? Is that likely to be the case with other countries?
Probably. I think if TEBIT offers as part of their package to calculate the weights, I would take them up on it. Because that's what we did with Digicel. They said they can give us basic frequency weights for nothing, and I said sure. That they served as our base, but we ended up doing so much reweighting that there's almost no correlation between the original weights. But it's good to have something, a place to start from. But probably, like I said, it depends a little bit on if you have a recent survey where you're recalling the participants in a country where you have to pay to register your number. We see response rates in the 90s in certain parts of the world in those cases. We're just not in that situation in either PNG or the Solomon Islands.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, lots of good technical questions there. Please, anybody else jump in?
Yes, please. Can you hear me? James here from UNICEF Suva. I just want to know whether, in terms of Solomon, did you have any quality assurance, because it was a Tebet was doing on the behalf of the World Bank? How did you assure the quality assurance in the process? Thank you.
We really don't. We had to depend on the reputation of Tebet. We don't do personal callbacks ourselves. We got, you know, as part of our contract, they had to send us their protocols, so we do know what they do. They do percentage callbacks. They do, you know, spot check verifications. They do, to some extent, calibration against other known information. But, you know, that's something that we sort of outsourced to them. We haven't found anything fishy in the PNG data yet. We're working on it, but we haven't seen anything that, you know, strikes us right away as perhaps a data quality issue. The first one I saw that I was worried about was that percentage of households that are pulling children out of school, because it just seemed astronomically high. And so I went to our education colleagues and said, you know, this is wrong, right? And they said, actually, no, that's about what we expect. And so we've been doing that with PNG. Solomon Islands, we're just about to jump into it. Like I said, I got the data set this morning, and we're just kind of, you know, making our initial passes over the data, tabbing variables, looking at relations, trying to see how everything lines up. So, you know, kind of maybe stay tuned for a week, and we'll sort of see how it shakes out.
Kristen, what's the plan now with disseminating these results?
So we have to crunch them. Like I said, I just got the Solomon Islands data set. We've been working on PNG. I think, honestly, I think it'll probably take us to the end of the month until we finish both reports. I think PNG will be done a little bit sooner, and then the Solomon Islands. But I think our communications team is going to want to package them so that they'll have a little bit more of an impact for media. We've have meetings next week about hiring a firm that specializes in data visualization, because I think what we'll do is we'll write the standard World Bank report, and, you know, it'll be a document. It'll include a thick technical appendix. It'll be jointly written with UNICEF, I think, in both PNG and the Solomon Islands, if we end up doing the planned follow-on surveys. And for those of you that haven't attended some of the other meetings, because we're sort of limited by this 15 minutes, it's very hard to be responsive to partners that need specialized questions. And UNICEF in particular asks a number of questions about children and people under the age of 16 and then people under the age of 5. So it's just not possible to accommodate that. So what we'll do is they're going to recall or recontact the eligible respondents. So we'll share our data set with them. They'll let Digicel know who they want to recontact. And then those people will be recontacted, then we'll merge the data sets together to do joint analysis so that they don't have to go through the pain of recreating that asset index. So we'll kind of put together a standard report like that, but because the audience for this work is not like a standard World Bank audience, we'll probably hire a company to help us do some visualizations, help us develop a social media presence, and sort of get this out there in a little bit more of a splashy, flashy way to have a little bit more impact. I mean, you know, I think you all know me. I tend to get a little technical on the methodology. You probably don't want me as a spokesperson for this product, so we'll try to package it in such a way that it's really accessible to policymakers and others. So that's with the report. With the data sets themselves, I would like to release both publicly. I think that we'll be able to do that in the Solomon Islands. We had an initial meeting with Douglas, and he didn't raise any immediate objections. So my hope is that, you know, once we show the preliminary results in the report, that he will continue not to have any objections, and we'll be able to release that data set. PNG is a much more complicated situation because of the situation with the NSO. It's not completely clear who has the authority to kind of grant us the ability to release this data. So I'm going to try. I will try to navigate that political situation so that data will get out there, but I'm a little bit less optimistic that I'll be able to make it work in the short term. So because I can't do that in PNG, and it'll take a little bit in the Solomon Islands, I am iterating with our lawyers to develop what we call a non-disclosure agreement, which is very similar to an MOU that you would sign for data access. And I intend to sign NDAs with pretty much anybody who's vaguely credible that wants data access. and make sure the data gets shared that way. So as long as they have something that sounds more or less academic, they have some kind of credentials that makes them sound like serious people, then I would be happy to sign a non-disclosure agreement to share the data.
I might take a turn asking you a question, Kristen. So I haven't been in Stats New Zealand for 3 months. I was seconded into the New Zealand's COVID National Crisis Management Centre, and part of what I'd have to say we were no model of best practice. These sort of surveys got a bit out of control, but the main concern had been to try and understand whether during the course of lockdowns and so forth, the circumstances of the most vulnerable people had deteriorated. And I was, looking at this. I mean, there may have been a different major goal to this activity, but so clearly, if that had been the purpose of this activity, you'd be fairly concerned about your capacity to say very much about that.
I am fairly concerned about my capacity to say very much about that. So as I said, it's not ideal. We're going to try to do better in the second round in terms of oversampling from what auxiliary information we have. We'll do what we can at the bottom 40%, which roughly corresponds to those living in poverty in both these countries. I won't be able to split it out much more than that. One of the other things that I'm a little more hopeful about is the World Bank is really concerned about the near poor and the newly poor, so people that were kind of in the 10 to 20 percentile above the poverty line, what's happening to them now? Because people that are below the poverty line, I think they've been on our radar, right? So, there's social assistance plans, whether or not they've been implemented to the best of their ability. But for the people that are most vulnerable, there's some sort of social assistance plan because they're identified. But for the people that weren't poor but are now poor, the newly poor, they wouldn't necessarily be on anybody's radar. So identifying those groups would be something that we would want to try to do. And so I think we're a little bit better there for those populations. Again, not ideal. I'll try to do better the next round. This was kind of a learning experience, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, the sense that I had, for what it's worth, of when they were running these sort of collections in New Zealand was that they were just trying to get ballpark order of magnitudes, because we had things like, so for example, our we did something. Well, I didn't, but there was something was done to try and get some understanding of the circumstances, how people with disabilities have been impacted on through the process. And that was mainly because people just had no idea, and they heard some rather nasty stories. So there was some anxiety that a lot of people, we had some stuff happen that shouldn't have happened, like because they had a medical model about who got designated as an essential worker, some people who provided support to people with disabilities, every day didn't get classified as essential workers, and that caused a whole mess, as you can just imagine. And it was more, so the purpose of these things was more to try and get an order of magnitude on things that you really just had no idea about what had happened. But is there more ambition to do something more finely tuned than that with some of these results?
I don't think now. I mean, maybe, so the reason that I'm the global co-coordinator on this is because I did the granddaddy of all these. The first mobile phone survey that the bank did in a crisis situation was 2014 in Liberia, and then Sierra Leone. And so I was the team leader there. And there, what we saw at the height of the crisis, it was orders of magnitude, right? What share of people are not working? And that's just like this graph here, like 20%. Probably not exactly 20%, but in terms of ballpark figures, it's good enough to get an idea. And we can break this out a little bit by sector and geography. But what we learned in Sierra Leone and Liberia is what is actually a lot more useful was the later rounds, these post-crisis rounds, because you know, things sort of went back to normal. I mean, the economy recovered. Basically, Ebola was done, the restrictions were lifted, but there, what we found is certain groups are being left behind, and the kind of the one that we get asked for the statistics all the time is market women. Liberian women who have, you know, they're food sellers, or they do small services in the market, and controlling for everything we could control for, education, location, everything. We found that women in these professions were just not going back to work. They had consumed their working capital and that they were left behind. And that's something that hadn't come out in the anecdotal evidence, that, you know, it wasn't necessarily something that we would have assumed in terms of the recovery process, but it was an important one because it's relatively easy to do micro grants. I mean, these are $5 US to restart a food selling business, just to, you know, get that working capital back. And so, you know, I think there, once we get to the recovery period where we're kind of pulling out different groups and doing a deep dive, and hopefully, you know, by the time we've done 4 or 5 of these rounds, we have it dialed in a little bit. Instead of kind of flying blind with the machine, we can probably do a little bit better targeting. And some of our respondents will also hopefully be with us for 4 or 5 rounds, so we can look at trajectories over time. So like I said, right now it's just trying to throw anything we can into the vacuum with some sort of quality assurance that it's reasonably good. But as this moves forward into recovery and next steps, then maybe we can think about something else.
Okay. I'm also I'm conscious that we haven't heard from Pia Kimweli or Viliami. I was sort of intrigued in whether your governments have been pushing for some sort of information, and what guidance you'd want from Kristen, given what you've heard.
Yeah, can I just jump in there? Thank you, Kristen. I think probably my largest concern is, you know, with this methodology, what would be the acceptable, you know, in regards to quality assurances and confidence intervals? What is the ballpark figure for, say, acceptable ballpark percentage in that? Because in a sense, for a small population such as ours, if we're going to target certain groups, say for example, the disabled group or groups or something, you know, among others, populations get very small. So in terms of non-responses, because through the use of phone calls, phone surveys, what would be an acceptable, say, ballpark figure in terms of the confidence interval? Thank you.
I mean, this is kind of, it's not any different than with your standard official statistics in coefficients of variation of 20 or something, you know, whatever you normally use in terms of determining what is representative to be published in terms of minimal levels of acceptable precision. So I don't think it's any, I mean, I don't think it's any different here. I think, you know, we have to be a little bit honest about the limitations of the instrument. Like, this isn't going to replace, you know, this isn't going to replace your HIES. This isn't going to replace your labor force surveys. This isn't going to replace your DHS. What this is good for, and what this instrument is good for, is, you know, if your government needs to know quickly what prices are doing, and that's something that this works really well for. If your government needs to know quickly about big changes in employment, that's something this can do. If big changes in school attendance, that's something this can do. So these types of questions, it's well suited. Very fine-grained, you know, careful, precise estimates. You know, it's just too blunt an instrument to really to do that. So yeah, it's big questions, general orders of magnitude, as Vince says, rather than being able to say, you know, the employment rate changed 5.2% last month.
just to add a little bit, just my query again. Our own challenges present. There are language barrier challenges that I envisage that we will encounter. How did you address those and keep the integrity of the general questions?
So the questionnaires were both translated. They were translated into Pidgin. So in the case of Tebet, we hired them to do the translation, and they, in their protocols, explained, the translation, back translation, and review process. For us, we had it translated in PNG by a translator that works basically for the World Bank office, translating official documents. And then we had one of our team members who's working with us in the Port Moresby office kind of go through and take a look and make sure that, everything was okay. The good thing about these questions is they're not overly complicated. And so, the phone surveys, you can't ask something that's particularly complicated because people will stop paying attention to you once the questionnaire gets too long. So because the questions were very simple, because that's kind of the nature of the instrument, it wasn't as hard to translate as some of the other surveys that I've worked on.
Okay. Any other queries, discussion?
Thank you. Thank you, Vincent. Can I come in?
Yes, of course.
I'd like to thank you, Kristen for the work on BNC and Solomon Islands, which we are looking forward for lesson learned to us. And just to answer your question on what our governments are trying to do during this pandemic era, government of Tonga is wanting us to do some sort of like a snapshot targeting type of survey, which is quite similar to what has been done in the Solomon Islands. And there's quite a lot of things that they wanted us to do. And I've listened to Kristen that there is some sort of like a macro data collection that you got some snapshot on employment or maybe income and some other areas. But with UNICEF trying to look into more details on getting some data level on children, especially having age groups, it seems like it's sort of like giving me some idea on a way forward that we might have some series of collection that might join up this later on. But I've been looking at I'm looking at the content of the questions, and of course we can't collect everything that we need, but just to give some sort of advisory to government and to see some priorities that might come up in order to prioritize what needs to be covered during a short period of time of interview on the telephone. I'm quite also aware of the difficulty in making a good representative, and especially when we get the number of telephones and how people are shifting from one phone to another, the SIM card. It's also another lesson learned to try and figure out how best we can attract, and I'm looking forward also for the results that are coming from Solomon Islands and the BNC. There's a lot of challenges. I think people in Tonga will might tell things the opposite way in terms of when you change the mode from the physical interview to the listening to the voice and without physically contacting with people. But I think they are all, what I'm trying to say, Vince, it's they are all lesson learned that we will pick up and choose from this maybe we can call it these two countries who are taking the lead on this exercise. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Viliami. So we're talking about this today. Is there anything that we're aiming to do more than get a general sense of what this tool might be fit for, bearing in mind, of course, as Kristen has explained, that we're still really learning what we might, what's a realistic expectation about what this mechanism can achieve. Is there something more specific that we're trying to do?
So Vince, yeah, we've got 3 more presentations. So David Abbott's presenting, then Chris Ryan, and then back to David. And I think at the end, David will present some recommendations for consideration by the board. So yeah, there's a little bit more to come.
Oh, look, my grovelling apologies, Michael. I hadn't appreciated the structure of what we were doing. David, please accept my apologies. I had no sense of what we were doing.
Okay, yeah, no problem, Vince. In fact, I think what you were about to say was going to lead pretty much into what I'm just going to talk about now, which is the intention of this meeting, listening to what Kristen has said about PNG and the Solomons, and coming to some general conclusion that it is a survey methodology that the Methods Board can, as it were, support in principle for us to continue discussions with other countries that might be interested, as Viliami has just said, that might be interested in having such a survey done in their countries. Now, one step towards this, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, on the 25th and 26th of June, we had a meeting of we invited 15 of the NSOs around the region, plus a range of development partners, to engage in a general dialogue about the need for and the coordination of these, what might be generally called rapid assessment surveys. So in that conversation, which was initiated very conveniently by IPEA as the chair of the HOPS, we had 9 government statisticians and a range of development partners, including DFAT, MFAT, and a number of the UN agencies involved in a broad discussion that gave each party the opportunity to explain what was going on, firstly, in the individual countries around the region, and how the interventions that were coming from development partners were being coordinated, and what the concerns and issues were amongst the governments. And what I'd just like to do is to lead into the discussion of the high frequency phone monitoring by sort of drawing on those discussions, which highlighted the issues that many of the government statisticians said that they were concerned that there was a lack of coordination on the part of many of the donors, that there were a number of surveys going on in each country being sponsored by different agencies, but those agencies weren't necessarily engaging with the governments or with the NSOs to establish an acceptable framework for those surveys. And what the issues that were raised included questions around how the surveys were set up in terms of the samples, on the concern about respondent fatigue, that if we were doing these phone surveys, or there were other random surveys from other partners, that it could lead to respondent fatigue, which could then have an adverse impact on the core collections that many of the governments have scheduled for this year, including the census round and the various HIES that are already scheduled. There was also some concern about the design of the questionnaire, and this is really something that has already been raised, that we need to make sure that the questionnaire meets the needs not just of the sponsoring agency, but also the priorities of the government. And I think this is something that Viliami has just raised. There were also questions about the costs of undertaking these surveys, not only in terms of the financial cost, but the resource costs in terms of the NSOs who might be brought in or might be required to provide support, and that could impact then again on their own survey programs, again for the census and HIES and so on. So those were a number of the issues. The other question was, I think, one of data ownership. Who would own the data and what would the quality controls on that data be? And again, those are points that have both been raised by Viliami and Ipir this morning. So I think what led on from this then was a discussion about whether countries would like to engage in the high frequency phone monitoring survey, a copy of the concept note of which has been shared with all the members, and whether this was something that we could bring together and try and coordinate with all the development partners in a way that would meet the needs both of the countries and of the partners, the sponsoring agencies and the funding agencies that might then come in to provide support to mitigate some of those impacts. And as Kristen has pointed out, one of the key findings in the PNG survey has been the number of people who have had to remove their children from school. So I mean, I think that's a really important policy issue that one of the development partners or donors would want to try and perhaps put funds in to address that. And if we can identify those sorts of issues through a high frequency phone monitoring, that would be one of the really significant benefits of having this survey done. It's not the micro level, but it's the macro level issues that can then be responded to by partners and by donors. So one of the things that then came out of that discussion that we had was the question of how can we improve the coordination. And I'm going to call on Chris now, who will outline a proposal that he's been developing in conjunction with us and with his UN partners as to how we can actually put in place a coordination mechanism that countries may wish to buy into, so that they can in fact take more country level ownership of the rapid assessment survey, so that we don't have too much duplication of effort, we don't have too much potential donor fatigue, and that the NSOs and the governments themselves have much greater control and say over the work that is being done in their countries, but at the same time meets their own particular needs and not just those of the partners. So Chris, can I hand over to you to what you've been working on, and then we'll come back to talk a little bit more about the high frequency phone monitoring and answer some of the questions, hopefully, that may be raised in terms of where do we go from here with the other countries.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I think that was a great introduction to what I'm going to talk about now. I mean, your little presentation and the one given by Kristen. I have got a little PowerPoint, so bear with me on the technology. We got it to work before. So I'm now hoping you can see my screen. Can someone, and you can hear me?
Yep. Chris, we can see it from here.
All right. All right. So what I just want to talk you through, I mean, is a concept note which I've developed addressing the issue of looking at potentially holding a series of national data collection workshops, which are going to be looking at the impacts of COVID-19 and covering not just these additional rapid assessment surveys, but also the impact that it might have on existing data collections that countries had planned. This is a very zero draft concept note, so it's a great time to present it to the methods board, because I'd really appreciate views on the value of conducting these national consultations, as well as on the approach which I'm going to put forward. And as I said, it's a zero draft. And in particular, I'm not necessarily hoping for feedback on the idea of the national consultations, but also feedback on how the results from these national consultations can be best used, and most importantly, what role the Pacific Stats Method Board could play in this process. Right, I can nearly skip over this slide now, because I think David covered it extremely well. I mean, this is the basis of the concept note which I developed on these national consultations came as a result of this meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, which David's already touched on. David mentioned there's quite a lot of really useful takeaways from these consultations, but I've picked out these three, which are the driving force behind this proposal to develop these national consultations. And David's already touched on these. The one is that there is good coordination taking place across the region to some degree, and there's even some good consultation happening at the national level. But I mean, we could do so much better, particularly at the national level, and how much coordination is taking place within government and also with partners. The second key takeaway was from the discussions was, although NSOs, some of them have some idea about what's happening, there are still in some countries where there's very little idea from the NSOs of what sort of surveys are being planned and proposed. And given they probably should be in a leadership role and undertaking these sort of data collections, we need to sort of rectify that to some degree. And the third thing is, I mean, since COVID-19's come on board, I mean, the data collection program for the Pacific region over the next couple of years has just been thrown out of whack in a fairly significant way. So we don't really know collectively what the survey program looks like over the concept notes focusing on the next 18 months, but we don't really have a good feel for what that survey program is going to look like over the next 18 months. So it makes it very hard for countries, partners and donors to plan the way forward. So just quickly, what the proposal is suggesting is have this series of national consultations, and we're talking one consultation per country. I'm suggesting here possibly working through the national government statisticians, although it wouldn't necessarily have to be, but given, as I mentioned previously, it would be great to see them in more of a leadership role with these surveys. That makes sense to me. And the three sort of key areas which we'd like to sort of tackle in these consultations, and it's just a meeting of 2 to 3 hours, similar to what we're doing today, is firstly at the national level, get everyone on the same page as what's happening or what's being planned in the country with respect to the data collections and the impact of COVID-19, so existing collections as well as new collections. The second one, which is where it becomes an issue for this discussion here, is if there is some recommendations from this specific stats method board moving forward with these rapid assessment surveys, what sort of guidance can we give these national consultations based on outcomes from this discussion today and tomorrow? And the third sort of key thing I could see coming or being discussed during these consultations is just then to deliberate amongst everyone on what path countries wish to take with how they tackle their existing surveys as well as any new rapid response assessment surveys. Who would be involved? I mean, the first three groupings there are all national. So, I mean, some countries that came up a couple of weeks ago at the meetings we had which David talked about. Some countries do have COVID-19 task force, so it would make sense that key members of those task forces would be involved. The government statistician or key NSO staff would definitely need to be involved, and any sort of senior government officials from line ministries most affected from COVID-19, such as health, labour, tourism and so forth. And then development partners who are involved in any of these existing surveys which are being currently planned over the next 18 months, or who want to be involved in conducting the additional rapid assessment surveys, such as the high frequency survey being discussed already by Kristen and David. The timing of these national consultations, I think they need to start as soon as possible. I think we're a little behind collectively as a group in conducting these sort of survey activities in the region. So I'll be proposing we could, if possible, get these things up and running in a week or so and try and wrap it up by the next month, if possible. All right, so in the concept note, I'm not sure how many people had a chance to look at it, but I have just put together, and this is just totally an example of what the draft agenda may look like for the 2 to 3 hour discussion, but I've broken it down into 3 potential sessions. The first one would just be just an overview of what's happening in the country at the moment. So it would be led by the country, hopefully by the NSOs, on what sort of existing sort of surveys are taking place, as well as any sort of rapid assessment surveys that they're aware of, and development partners can then add to that on what plans they have in those countries, which the countries may already know about, but maybe they don't. The second session would be then this possibility of providing some guidance as a result of these discussions today and tomorrow from the Pacific Stats Methods Board, just some little tips on what countries might want to take on board in moving ahead with undertaking rapid assessment surveys. And it may just be something simple like these are a couple of examples of survey approaches, such as what World Bank and SPC are promoting, and the methods boards backs and support them. So guidance like that at these national consultations. And the last session is just like an open plenary, just talking about, or getting some sort of agreement on moving forward with both existing data collections as well as any additional sort of rapid assessment surveys. To make the national workshop sort of worthwhile, in the concept note I've also added a couple of templates which could be populated. I mean, if you jump down to the bottom point in italics, I mean, they could be populated during the workshop as well as after the workshop. You wouldn't expect necessarily all the answers to come forward, but 2 templates. One is looking at the impact on the existing data collections, censuses, agricultural censuses, HIES, mix, whatever. And then populated with just basic information. I mean, who's involved, what's the current funding situation, what impacts of COVID-19 is it having on the operations, timing, methodology and so forth. So I've did a very draft template in the concept note, and it still needs quite a bit of work. And the second template would be focusing on what the plans may be for any additional rapid assessment sort of surveys. And once again, what government departments and development partners would be involved, what the current funding situation is, if there's any funds at all, where the focus of the survey content would be. It might differ from country to country. What data collection details countries might want to adopt, and sampling approaches. And I mean, it may well be, when countries populate these templates, for template 2, they say, yep, we want to adopt the World Bank SPC approach, but maybe tweak this aspect here and there. So that could be the feedback that could come out of these sort of workshops. And as I said, this is a template focusing on just the next 18 months, where we anticipate COVID-19 would have the most impact. This is just, David sort of touched on it. What value could we get out of these sort of national consultations? And where I can see it moving towards is hopefully collectively as a group, countries, partners, donors and so forth, putting together an agreed sort of survey plan in place over in particular, the next 18 months. It could go beyond, if you like. This was one of the things I think Offa put in the chat during the meeting a couple of weeks ago about, we've sort of, and I mentioned this at the start, we don't really know what's happening with data collections in the foreseeable future. So these national consultations could help a lot. So these 3 boxes here could be viewed as 3 phases. So the first phase would be seen as the national consultations, which could be carried out hopefully by the end of the month. And then the second one, it wouldn't necessarily involve the countries. It could be just a matter of partners and donors coming together to discuss, what's feasible from a technical assistance and a financing perspective. So based on the results from the national consultation, and it could mean also between those 2 phases that there would be a bit of work required on putting some dollar amounts to what surveys come out of the national consultations. But then the third phase would be bringing everyone back together, similar to what we did a couple of weeks ago, and put something on the table. I mean, this is what the countries have wanted from the consultations. This is what partners and donors think is feasible, and then collectively agreeing to what could potentially be achieved realistically over the next 18 months. So that's basically all I had to say. I mean, I'll just finish with a few points on what I was hoping to get some feedback from this methods board meeting. Firstly, just your views on the usefulness of undertaking such a consultation workshop. I mean, the second, the possibility of developing some basic guidelines on carrying out these surveys to present at these consultation workshops. I'm not sure how realistic that may be. It may be just a matter more of the methods board endorsing certain approaches, because these surveys can be conducted very differently. But also the possibility of maybe the methods board playing a role of once countries decide what path they may want to go down, and if it's already an agreed methodology, that's fine, but if they want to do something slightly different, perhaps the method board could play a clearing role for these sort of rapid assessment surveys. And I just want one last point to make on that last one. I have already seen some of these surveys being implemented by development partners in the Pacific, and they are not adopting suitable methodologies, even with respect to questionnaire design and so forth. So I think there is possibly a role the method board could play in making an offer to the countries to clear some of these surveys from a methodological aspect. I think that's all I had to say at this stage. I'm not sure how I take myself off screen share.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So because I didn't appreciate that we had so many presentations, I didn't manage time in the previous discussion of Kristen's presentation very well, so that's a failure on my part. So I'm sort of conscious at time. Are people able to talk for another 10 or 15 minutes? Or maybe just if you're not, just quietly leave the meeting. I mean, I'm in the middle of the day here for me.
I'd rather prefer to have another extra minute, Mr. Chairman. Can I make some comments?
Absolutely, go for it. I'm just checking. I was just going to check first of all. I was just going to say to people, if you have to go when we said go, but please, I was just going to say, I'm happy to talk to go to 1:15 or so. You know, I can do that if other people are able to. But please go, William.
Thank you so much, Chris and David, for a process mapping that highlights possible options where we can go from here. I think the session 1, session 2, session 3 of your slides are very important. The national consultant is crucial so that we can contextually respond to our national needs. And I think, like what I've said earlier, the things that I've got from Kristen's presentation, we might have a compulsory section for the COVID in terms of questionnaires, and then we can tweak our own individual separate needed questions as the model that UNICEF is doing, and then we can combine it, and so we might get some idea from the exercise in PNG and the Solomon Islands, the combination of what the World Bank is doing and what the UNICEF is going to add on the module. So in terms of what we have done in the past, we have already exercised this sort of things. We have compulsory questions on our censuses, for example. Let's say, for example, our disability identification questions, which might me think as a group in terms of our Pacific Islands, we might think of compulsory sections that might be a rapid assessment of the impact of the COVID-19 that will be similar to all of us. And then we might have some separate sections among two individual countries too. But I think the timeline proposed and what has been outlined by the last presentation is something very clear in terms of our process and what we are going to do. We have been doing our informal national discussions about what's needed by government, and I think we can fill in the template soon, and if that's the way that the method board is approving for way forward. But I think what David and Chris has been outlined is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Viliami.
Vince, can I just, unless someone else wants to speak, can I just sort of follow up on what Chris and Viliami has said? I think there are two issues that we would particularly like the methods board to consider here. One is the general principle that we should offer the coordination workshops to countries and invite them to say whether they'd like to participate or not. So that means that what we're asking is whether the methods board agrees in principle to what Chris has put forward. So if we're agreeing in principle to that, we can then take it to the next stage and invite countries to be part of the process or not, depending on their own particular perspectives. The second point is to note that the concept note that we shared with you on the high frequency phone monitoring was a general concept note that was originally available for everyone to understand what the high frequency phone monitoring was, as Kristen has already explained, in terms of the World Bank having done those two, if we might call them, pilot programs in PNG and Solomons. The issue now is that if we generally agree that those phone monitoring surveys are a useful tool, they would become, I think, the first component in the innovative part of the IDA project. So there is a direct link between what we're discussing now on the HFPM with the IDA project that we started off discussing earlier this morning. So what we would again like the methods board to do is to endorse, if you like, in principle, that we should pursue the idea of high frequency phone monitoring surveys amongst other countries in the region and invite them to, as it were, express interest in having a high frequency phone monitoring survey conducted in their country. Now, obviously, if a country expresses an interest, there are a whole raft of things that we would then need to discuss with them, and that would include things around the sample size, the methodology, the questionnaire in particular, and as Viliami has said, we would need to look at having a core set of questions, as Kristen has outlined, and then bring on board a number of other questions that are relevant for the country or for individual sectors. And whilst we might not be able to incorporate all of those in one round, we would then be able to discuss a questionnaire that could be developed in subsequent rounds or in subsequent surveys, as Kristen has outlined for UNICEF in PNG and the Solomons. So the point is, can we get the board's approval that we should proceed with these two concepts, the coordination workshops and the conduct of high frequency phone monitoring? Can we take these forward to the next stage? And as Mike said before, if we are going to do this, we can maybe have an interim meeting of the methods board in maybe a month or 6 weeks time to again review where we've got to, which countries are likely to come on board and how we process that going forward. So we would be aiming to use some of the money from the IDA project, but we might also be able to encourage development partners and donors to also put in funds, and we would be looking to see how we could fund at least part of the program from our own resources here at SPC. So it's a question of, can we take these forward, and will the methods board approve this going forward?
Okay, so thank you, David. That's a nice, clear question for us. Now we'll try and spend 10 minutes just, so first of all, look, I sense, and it's hard to do this over the virtual, that there's some enthusiasm for this as a possibility. We're clearly, it's a new tool and we're going to have to learn as we go, but it's if the alternative is for governments to fly blind in terms of things that they should know about, this seems to be a considerable improvement on flying blind. So my sense is that we would be keen to have it go to the next stage, but I want to make it very clear that if people are concerned about that as a direction, please state that opinion now. I've got a big picture of Bruce on my screen, wondering who's going to launch into.
Yeah, I am unmuted, but I wanted to give people a chance. Look, I support the consultation workshops and the whole general direction. I'll just remind, I don't guess anyone's forgotten about this, but we are talking about rapid assessment surveys, and based on the ABS experience, because we've done some of these in Australia, you do have to be prepared to work in somewhat different ways, and maybe take a few shortcuts and maybe not apply the full rigor that you otherwise would. I mean, I hear what Chris says, maybe some of what's been done is a bit ordinary, but there's a sweet spot. And we just need to be careful, like we don't put too many barriers and hurdles and clearances and things that stand in the way of timely data. Even when we're deciding on survey content, like 15 minutes might be a good length in terms of the amount of time that you can extract information out of a provider. But the more questions, that also adds to the processing time and delays in getting stuff out. So, what I'm saying is perhaps not revolutionary, but it is a unique challenge, I guess, trying to balance the rapid aspect of this with our normal inclination and instinct to do a very good job and a very rigorous job.
Okay. Right, we may call on you to give advice about what that actually means in practice down the track, Bruce. Other comments?
Sure.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Go for it.
I also support the idea of the two presentations that were done by Chris and Dave. But at the moment, I think for countries that haven't yet experienced or haven't had COVID-19 yet, I think my idea is okay. I'd like to make an assessment on how the current strategy of say the COVID-19 task force within those countries, how effective those programs have been, and how that knowledge has been transferred to the public at the moment, and have the actual rapid assessments as a plan B. So perhaps this is a rapid assessment on the knowledge-based issues, on the issues of COVID-19, and also an assessment of the current activities by existing task force within countries, if there are task force. I don't know it does, and how the knowledge has been transferred to the public, and also not just the public, but also to the agencies on how responsive those agencies are if COVID-19 does eventually land. And I think that's my current view on say addressing the presentations of a public consultation or government public sector consultation.
Would it be fair to say, Pierre, so you were saying that you are, that the surveys need to be put in their place, and I think you just referred to them as a plan B, but you don't have any objection to this process proceeding as proposed?
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, for our circumstances, yes. For the regional approach and our approach for the PSMB, but yeah, I was also thinking about at the country levels for those countries that need to make assessments of their own responsiveness and vulnerabilities and resilience. I think the particular survey needs to be designed in that sense as well.
Right. Yep. Now I can imagine particularly small island states maybe in the place of this as a tool in small island states may be quite a different thing to think about. That's appreciated. It's a good point. Other comments?
Can I quickly jump in, Vince? It's Tracy here.
Yep.
In author's absence, I think I could say that the Stats NZ Pacific programs support this as a way forward. We think the roundtables or the workshops that Chris has put together, the concept note for, will be very useful for addressing the issues that were raised at the recent discussions. Ultimately, it's most important to us whether the NSOs think they'll be beneficial, and I think we've heard, from Vidiyami and Apia that they would. A couple of quick points. We think that the government information needs need to be the driver, and maybe that's implicit in your thinking, Chris, but sort of each different country starting the workshop with what are their key information needs. But perhaps that might need some assistance. I know at the roundtable there was some request for sort of what are the key indicators that we should be looking at and how do we prioritise those. And a flip to that is then what is the best way to meet those information needs? So that may be an existing collection, so do you defer that or not? It may be a new collection like the rapid surveys, but we also need to consider in that sphere, I think, administrative data. Because something like the school enrolments potentially, or the school participation, perhaps that may come from education administrative data. So yeah, so potentially a little bit of a widening, but maybe that was all part of sort of the thinking behind the proposal. The other quick comment was that sort of middle phase that you pointed out about sort of regional discussion and things sounds very much like a HOPS PSSC group type discussion potentially. I'm not suggesting that there's a HOPS PSSC meeting, but that idea of sort of donors and development partners and NSOs kind of agreeing on some kind of plan and way forward. So whether that needs that kind of group to approve might be an option. That was all. Thank you.
Okay.
Vince, if I can just follow up on what Tracy has just said. In fact, at the roundtable meeting we had with the NSOs and partners a few weeks ago, one of the conclusions of that was that we should continue to hold these roundtable meetings so that there was a greater sharing of information and coping strategies at the government level going forward. So it will, if we do that, then it will help to make sure that everybody across the region is on the same wavelength. So I think that's an important point.
Okay. Conscious that I've kept you because of my own ineptitude as chair longer than was originally planned. I feel that you have, I feel I'm happy in the result of what I've heard to give this proposal the approval in principle that it's asked for. And particularly if we do accept the idea of coming back in August, I'm sure by then we'll have a much clearer sense of what we're all, you know, how that, what shape it might take or has taken in that time. So I think I'd like to conclude this session now. Thank you very much for all the input. Look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, and wish everybody good day and a good night's sleep to Kristen, for whom that's not so far away.